Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Maranatha Global Bible Study on the book of Revelation. As we dig a little further into the meat of chapter 1 today, describing the New Jerusalem, I'm really looking forward to this session. I think it'll be fun. We get to turn on our imaginations a little bit and visualize the things that John is saying. So today is going to be, Bible. It's also going to be some math. It's going to be some geography, it's going to be some astronomy, it's going to be some art, it's going to be some science, it's going to be like a whole day of Christian homeschool wrapped up into an hour. So put your thinking caps on and turn your imaginations on and buckle your seatbelts because it's going to be a fun ride today, I think. And as we go through these next few verses of chapter 21, verses 9 through almost to the end of the chapter. We'll kind of do a brief survey of these things. I won't have a lot of time to really dig into the meat of things. But then Joel Richardson's going to come along and do a deep dive into some aspects of this chapter that I think will be very interesting as well. So it just gets better and better here at the end of the book of Revelation, at the end of redemptive history, the beginning of eternal history. And so let's go ahead and jump in and get started. We're going to start today in verse 9, where we left off last time. And this is as John is being given a vision of the New Jerusalem and begins to describe in a little bit more detail what he's seeing. And so we get to talk about some of the implications of what he emphasizes in the New Jerusalem. So, starting with verse 9. Then came one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls full of the seven last plagues. Those are the angels that came out of the heavenly temple in chapters 15 and 16 and poured out the plagues on the earth as the last judgments of God. And he spoke to me, saying, "Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb." And he carried me away in the Spirit to a great high mountain, and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, having the glory of God, its radiance like a most rare jewel, like a jasper, clear as crystal. Okay, so you can see there that I broke up those verses into several chunks and bolded certain portions of them that I wanted to emphasize, and we'll go back over those. So John meets up with this angel, one of the angels that had poured out the seven plagues on the earth right before the invasion of the earth by Jesus and his heavenly army. And he says, "Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb." We've already established in previous sessions that at this point, God's covenant people and God's covenant city are both properly understood to be the bride of Christ. And in fact, John has described all the way back in chapter 3, quoting Jesus, language that describes us, the saints, as being pillars in the temple of God, or pillars in the New Jerusalem of God. So in some ways, we the people and the city of Jerusalem are synonymously understood to be the bride of Jesus, the bride of the Lamb. And it says, he carried me away in the Spirit. This is not the first time that John has used that language in Revelation, going all the way back to chapter 4. Right as he finishes writing down the letters to the seven churches, beginning of chapter 4, verse 1, he says, "After this I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven. And the first voice, which I had heard speaking to me like a trumpet, said, 'Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this.' At once I was in the Spirit. And behold, a throne stood in heaven with one seated on the throne." So here, John, after he records the letters to the seven churches, hears this same voice that was loud like a trumpet calling him up to heaven. So he's called up to the throne room of God. And he says he's in the Spirit when this happens. Interestingly, if you read 2 Corinthians 12, the Apostle Paul describes a much similar scenario in which he describes being caught up to the third heaven, which could be understood, I believe, to be a description of the throne room of God, the same place that John was taken up to, the highest heaven where the throne of God is. And Paul says, I don't even know if I was in the body or out of the body. And he doesn't use the language in the Spirit, but he describes this same act of being caught up to the third heaven that John describes. And so this is apparently something that the Lord has done on more than one occasion, with at least two of the apostles that we know of. Also later in Revelation 17, the beginning of the narrative about Mystery Babylon. Verse 1, then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and said to me, come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters. And he carried me away in the Spirit into a wilderness. So once again, one of those same angels that had poured out the seven plagues, facilitating John somehow in the Spirit to a wilderness or a desert, where he witnesses the prostitute riding the beast back in chapter 17. So here once again in chapter 21, we have one of those same angels, we don't know if it's the same one, but one of those same seven angels taking John away in the Spirit to a high mountain, this time not to see something disturbing and sinful and evil and wicked, but to see something beautiful, to see something glorious, not to see destruction, but to see eternal life. Also, John describes the city coming down from heaven as having the glory of God. It's amazing to think about the fact that we, in our resurrected bodies, get to share in God's glory. We get to not only experience God's glory, but share in God's glory. For instance, Romans 8:17, Paul writes, and if children, heirs also, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with him, so that we may also be glorified with him. We be glorified with Jesus. That Jesus in his resurrected, glorified body, we being his bride, get to share not only in that resurrection and life with him, but in that glory with him as a co-heir. Romans 8:30, these whom he predestined, he also called, and these whom he called, he also justified, and these whom he justified, he also glorified. And finally, Colossians 3:4, when Christ, who is our life, is revealed, then you also will be revealed with him in glory. So it's amazing to think that the city that is coming down from heaven is just filled with the glory of God, and that we, as co-heirs with Christ, as his bride, in this glorious city, also get to share in and exude his glory. All right. Let's move along to verse 11. We'll read verses 11 through 13 now. This is where it's going to get a little technical, but we'll talk about all of the cool things embedded in this sort of technical language here. So beginning in verse 13, speaking about the New Jerusalem coming out of heaven, it had a great high wall with 12 gates, and at the gates 12 angels. And on the gates, the names of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel, remember that wording, were inscribed. On the east 3 gates, on the north 3 gates, on the south 3 gates, and on the west 3 gates. And the wall of the city had 12 foundations, And on them were the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. So the names of the 12 sons of Israel on the 12 gates, the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb on the 12 foundations of the wall. And the one who spoke with me had a measuring rod of gold to measure the city and its gates and walls. The city lies 4 square, its length the same as its width. And he measured the city with his rod, 12,000 stadia. Its length and width and height are equal. He also measured its wall, 144 cubits, or 12 times 12 cubits, by human measurement, which is also an angel's measurement. So here, John watches as the angel has this measuring rod. And he begins measuring out the city, which apparently is using the same measurement system at this point in human history and angelic history that is the same as angels compared to humans. And he measures out a perfectly square city in terms of length and breadth, 12,000 stadia. We'll talk about that number in a minute. And also the height of the city, the height of the wall and the city behind it is also 12,000 stadia. Okay, so it's a perfect cube. And the wall itself is 144 cubits thick. So there's a couple ways to interpret this, these measurements. You could interpret this as being a representation of perfection. That is the number 12 appearing throughout the book of Revelation, describing the people of God, whether it be the 12 stars over the woman's head or the 24 elders, 12 times 2 around the throne of God, the 144,000, which is 12,000 from each tribe in chapter 7. So you could look at these numbers as just being symbolic of a perfect or complete number. And that's a debate that can be had. And I'm not super dogmatic about this. I tend to land on the side of these measurements being real. The reason being because in this narrative, John is describing an angel with a measuring rod. And there's other places in Scripture where we see this kind of language, an angel measuring something out, that is in reference to an actual structure. Okay? So let me just say up front, disclaimer, if what I'm saying is true, if we're really talking about a city that is 12,000 stadia long and wide and tall, that is massive. And we're going to talk about how massive in just a few minutes. But just to make the point first, that there's a reason why I believe this is probably in reference to the actual dimensions of the city, of the New Jerusalem, and what kind of implications that will have for the new earth to support a city of this size. For instance, if we go back to Ezekiel 40, verses 1 and 2, and then verse 5, Ezekiel also is having a vision similar to John's of what we would describe as the Millennial Temple. It's a temple structure with a priesthood and offerings that have, to this point, never existed. This temple is not the first or second temple in terms of its dimensions. The priesthood being described here and the offerings being described in later chapters are not prescribed in the Torah, in Exodus and Leviticus. So we would believe that this temple is yet future. This priesthood, you could say this new covenant priesthood, is yet future in the millennial Jerusalem, the Jerusalem of Jesus' kingdom, the 1,000-year reign of Christ. So reading these verses, the hand of the Lord was upon me, Ezekiel, and he brought me to the city, that is in context Jerusalem. In visions of God, so again, this is somewhat parallel to being taken in the Spirit. In visions of God, he brought me to the land of Israel and set me down on a very high mountain, just as John was also taken to a very high mountain by the angel, on which was a structure like a city to the south. And behold, there was a wall all around the outside of the temple area, and the length of the measuring reed in the man's hand, this man being described in other verses as an angelic figure, the length of the measuring reed in the man's hand was 6 long cubits, each being a cubit and a handbreadth in length. So he measured the thickness of the wall, 1 reed, and the height 1 reed. So here again, we have Ezekiel having a similar vision of what we would say is the Millennial Temple, and an angelic figure with a measuring rod measuring out the wall around this temple that's described as being like a city. Now, my amillennial brethren would make the case, well, Gabe, this is not necessarily a literal structure either. This is a structure that's describing the church. In fact, I just had some interaction with some dear brothers on Twitter this past week about that. And what I'd say, first of all, is if you actually read through Ezekiel 40 through 48 and the descriptions of the dimensions of the temple and all the different rooms and the priestly offerings and the details inherent in those and the land allotments to the 12 tribes, it's hard for me to see how all of that detail, very precise detail, in 8 chapters relates to the church. I'm not sure what to do with that if it's just the church. It feels like a lot of words, a lot of detail to just say the church, a lot of unnecessary detail that I can't do anything with if we're not talking about an act. I don't know how to relate all of these things to the church if that's the case. And that also doesn't jive with the pattern that God uses throughout Scripture, that when he's describing the dimensions of something, for instance, Noah's Ark in Genesis 6, or the tabernacle in Exodus 25, 26, 27, or the first temple in 1 Kings 6 or in 2 Chronicles, and then again here in Ezekiel 40 with the Millennial Temple, all of these are or were actual structures. It wasn't that Moses didn't actually construct a tabernacle and that it was just written down for the Israelites to imagine that there would be a people of God known as the church one day. He built the tabernacle. Solomon built the first temple. And so Noah built the ark. And so there's no reason to believe that here yet again in Ezekiel 40 or yet again in Revelation 21 that we're not also talking about actual dimensions for actual structures. Again, if we're reading this plainly, this is the hermeneutic we've used all throughout the book of Revelation. If we're reading the book plainly, whether it's Ezekiel 40 through 48 or Revelation 21 and 22, we're not going to read this and say, oh, this is just some spiritualized representation, allegory, metaphor for the church. You wouldn't get that out of this if you were just reading it plainly. You would get, oh, this is dimensions to a structure. This is dimensions to a city. So that's why, again, I don't fall really dogmatically on that side. If I turn out to be wrong, great. We can all laugh and enjoy it. My errors in teaching in the New Jerusalem together. But that is why I tend to fall on the side of believing that John is describing the actual dimensions of the New Jerusalem. And if that is the case, that has some pretty serious implications because this is a big city. Talk about that in a minute. Next, I just want to point out really quick, again, talking about all the 12s in this city. Okay, the number 12 throughout the book of Revelation representing the people or the creatures of God who are worshiping God. We have 12 city gates. We have 12 angels at those gates. We have 12 tribal names and names of the tribes of Israel on those gates. The wall has 12 foundations. There are 12 apostolic names on those foundations. The dimensions of the city, length, width, height, is 12,000 stadia. And the thickness of the wall is 144 cubits, or 12 times 12. So just for reference, a cubit is considered to be about 18 inches, or about 46 centimeters. So 144 cubits would be roughly 216 feet, or 66 meters. That's the thickness of the wall. Remember, the height is 12,000 stadia. The thickness of the wall is 60 meters. It's over 200 feet, 2/3 of a football field, American football. Sorry for my non-American viewers. So that gives you an idea of how thick the wall is that is being described here. So let's talk about the size of the city then. 12,000 stadia can be calculated out to 1,380 miles, or 2,220 kilometers. When you square that, because it's 12,000 stadia squared, the city's a perfect cube, that is 1.9 million square miles, or 4.9 million kilometers square. Now remember, the city is a cube, so we actually have to cube that number, length, width, and height, to get its volume. If you times 12,000 by 12,000 by 12,000 stadia and convert that into miles, that's 2.6 billion cubic miles, or 11 billion kilometers cubed. That is massive. Okay? To give you some perspective here, Greater New York City is roughly 4,700 square miles, or 12,000 kilometers square, which means the New Jerusalem being described here is 400 times larger than Greater New York City. 400 times bigger than New York. The current population of New York City is around 8 million people. Times that by 400, it's 3,200,000,000 people. That is 1/2 the area of the United States. It is roughly the size of the country of India, slightly larger than India. And it's 10 times the size of France. The total volume of the New Jerusalem, the whole cube, is more than half the size of the Earth's moon. So you have something half as big as the moon sitting on the Earth. If that's the real measurement of this city, the new Earth is going to have to be a lot bigger than the old Earth. A lot bigger. For instance, here's a map. You can see here that somebody traced the lines of the wall of the city on this map. So if you laid the New Jerusalem over the current Jerusalem, this is what it looks like. It stretches from what is today southern Greece all the way east to the Caucasus Mountains near Russia, all the way south to close to the edge of the Arabian Peninsula where Yemen is, and across to western Yemen, south of Libya. That is massive. That ain't going to fit in the current geography of the earth. And obviously here we're talking about a new heavens and a new earth, which if the city really is this big, would have to be very different to support that. But even more so than that, remember, we're not just talking about a square, we're talking about a cube. So here's another representation of what the New Jerusalem would look like if you sat it on top of today's Jerusalem. A couple things to point out here. That red line that you see towards the bottom of that paper origami cube, that's the top of Earth's atmosphere. So Earth's atmosphere is roughly only 100 kilometers up. And this is a city, remember, that stretches, its walls stretch, the city itself stretches up 2,220 kilometers. So if the New Jerusalem landed on the current Earth, you'd have all kinds of problems, but one of those would be you wouldn't be able to breathe in 95% of the city because there's no atmosphere. And also notice this. Remember that the earth isn't flat. Sorry to disappoint any flat earthers that may be watching, but the earth is definitely round. That has been scientifically proven in many, many ways for centuries. And so you can see here that if the city is perfectly square, is a perfect cube, it doesn't fully rest on the earth. The earth isn't big enough. It's kind of like if you take a block and set it on top of a tennis ball, the cubed block doesn't sit flat on the tennis ball. It kind of wobbles over it, right? You'd have the same issue with the New Jerusalem. And so this obviously, as I said, begs the question, how big does the new earth need to be if in fact the New Jerusalem is this big? A Christian mathematician used the Pythagorean theorem. Remember that from high school geometry class? Neither do I. Maybe there's some math teachers out there that can describe it in the comments because I'm not even going to try to. He used the Pythagorean theorem to calculate how large the new earth would need to be in order for that large of a city to lie flat on it, all of its edges resting flat on the earth. And obviously, well, I don't know if we'll need to breathe oxygen in the new heavens and the new earth. Maybe the whole universe will be filled with oxygen. Who knows? But how big would the earth need to be to just even support a city of that size? So he did the math, and here it is. It's a whopper. The current circumference of the earth, that is, if you flew around the earth on an airplane, close to the ground, at the equator in the middle, it's about 25,000 miles or 40,000 kilometers. To support the New Jerusalem, the earth would need to be around the equator 9.3 billion miles. Not tens of thousands, billions of miles. And 15 billion kilometers. The largest known star that we're aware of in the current universe, this is a large red supernova star, the biggest you can get, millions of times larger than our sun, is only 7 billion miles, I say only, in its circumference, or 11 billion kilometers. That means that the new Earth would need to be larger than the largest star that we're aware of in the universe today to support this city. That's just unthinkable. Boggles the mind, as my grandparents from Minnesota used to say. So, now that we've kind of established the scope of the city that we're talking about, let's talk a little bit more about the visuals, right? How the city looks, the aesthetic. So continuing on into verse 19, the foundations of the wall of the city were adorned with every kind of jewel. Remember, there's 12 foundation stones there. The first was jasper, the second sapphire, the third agate, the fourth emerald, the fifth onyx, the sixth carnelian, the seventh chrysolite, the eighth beryl, the ninth topaz, the 10th Christophras, the 11th jacinth, and the 12th amethyst. And the 12 gates were 12 pearls, each of the gates made of a single pearl. And the street of the city was pure gold, like transparent glass. So, again, turn your imaginations on here for a minute. John is looking at the city that stretches way further than his eye can see, in every direction, up, out, across. Can't even see the ends of it. And he sees these gates that are massive gates carved from a single pearl. In John's day, in ancient Rome, pearls were some of the most precious and rare and valuable resources in the entire Roman Empire. More so than gold. Hence Jesus' parable of the great price, or the pearl of great price. That when this man found this pearl, he sold everything else so that he could keep this pearl. Okay, so the gates of the city are made out of this incredibly valuable pearl, carved out of one piece. There aren't even pearls that come close to that size in the current heavens and earth. The 12 foundations of the city are 12 different types of stone. There are a particular type of stone we know now that I'm going to let Joel talk about a bit about that in a future session. It's very interesting just to get into the different types of stone that are in the foundation of the wall, including properties of these stones that people weren't aware of in the ancient world, that we're only aware of today, that makes this narrative even more amazing and helps us to put our faith even more so in the truth of the inspiration of Scripture. That John's writing about things that he wouldn't have even been aware of, that the scientific world as it existed then wasn't aware of in that day. For instance, here's a representation of what the 12 foundation stones might look like. Using colors that are common, so it would be jasper at the bottom. Jasper, again, comes in many different colors. That's not the color isn't its only property. But one of the most common colors for jasper is that sort of orangey, rusty color you see there at the bottom. And amethyst and purple at the top. So you can kind of see this whole spectrum of colors here in the 12 foundations of the city wall anyway. So again, we're talking about gemstones and gold and pearls in a new heavens and a new earth that have properties that don't exist in those same things today. John is seeing these things and describing them to the best of his ability. For instance, when Paul was talking about being caught up to the third heaven, he said he heard things that can't be repeated or described. So John is doing his best to describe things that he's seeing in front of him. That's in literally a whole new world. Gold isn't clear like glass. Even in its most refined form, you can't call it transparent. It's a metal. So he's seeing this stone or this metal, whatever it is, that looks like gold, but it's almost clear. It's that pure and refined. I also want to point out that the stones being described, the gemstones being described in the foundations of the city, are very similar to, and in many cases identical to, the stones that would be used in the high priest's ephod in the Levitical system. So going all the way back to Exodus 28, verses 15 through 21, the Lord speaking to Moses about the fabrication of the ephod, he says, "You shall make a breastpiece of judgment, in skilled work. In the style of the ephod you shall make it, of gold, blue and purple and scarlet yarns, and fine twined linen you shall make it. It shall be square and doubled, a span its length and a span its breadth. You shall set in it 4 rows of stones, a row of sardius, topaz, and carbuncle shall be the first row, and the second row an emerald, a sapphire, and a diamond, and the third row a jacinth, an agate, and an amethyst, and the fourth row a beryl, an onyx, and a jasper. They shall be set in gold filigree. There shall be 12 stones with their names according to the names of the sons of Israel. Sound familiar? They shall be like signets, each engraved with its name for the 12 tribes. So the high priest, under the Mosaic law, wore an ephod with a breastplate that had a square. Remember, the city is square. A square of 12 stones. These stones have on them the names of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel, the same exact language that John used to describe the names of the tribes of the sons of Israel inscribed on the doors or the gates of the New Jerusalem. And 9, at least 9, out of the 12 stones that go in the breastplate are the same as the stones that go in the foundation of the wall of the New Jerusalem. And it's possible that all 12 do. We're not really sure about the proper translation of the Hebrew word for 3 of these stones. But when the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, were translated into Greek about 200-300 years before Jesus was born, the Greek words used to translate these stones were the exact same 12 that John uses in Revelation 21. So as far as the translators of the rabbinic translators of the Hebrew scriptures are concerned, the stones in the ephod and the stones that John is seeing in the New Jerusalem, remember the Septuagint was in wide use in the Roman world in the days of Jesus and the apostle, and often when they would quote from the Old Testament, they're quoting from the Septuagint. The exact same 12 stones. So we have a square breastplate that represents a square city. It's made with gold filaments, as there is gold throughout the New Jerusalem, clear as glass. And there are 12 stones engraved with the 12 names of the sons of Israel, just as there are 12 foundations of those same stones in the New Jerusalem. And you might say, wait a minute, Gabe, the 12 foundations are engraved with the names of the apostles. It's the gates of pearl that are engraved with the names of the sons of Israel. Yet again, this demonstrates the unity and the totality of God's people. 12 sons of Israel, 12 apostles. And yet, those 12 apostles who aren't necessarily from the 12 different tribes. In fact, there were 2 pairs of brothers with the same parents, so they couldn't have been from 12 different tribes. Yet they share in that same glory of these 12 shining gemstones that the sons of Israel do. And so, again, I'll leave some more interesting details. I'll tease out Joel's next session. He's going to be going more into detail about these stones and their scientific properties, what makes them all unique and similar to one another in ways that was not known in the ancient world, for a next session. So here is a picture of the high priest's ephod with the breastplate there in the middle, the 4 rows of 12 stones, each represented in different colors with the names, the Hebrew names of the sons of Israel engraved on them. And I thought it would be cool to show you some artistic representations of the New Jerusalem. So this, as far as we know, is the first artistic representation of the city from the 13th century. It's in France on a tapestry. You can see it's probably a little bit too small, but it's John interacting with the angel there who's pointing out the city. And then this is a more modern representation of what the New Jerusalem might look like. You see the Greco-Roman, might be Baroque architecture. I don't know. If somebody knows their architecture, they can comment. And you see the artist's representation of what gold clear as glass might look like. And of course, even our wildest imaginations are going to fall short. When we see this city one day, with new eyes, by the way, in a new body, imagine what our sight and our hearing and our taste is going to be like in this new body, let alone what we're going to be seeing in front of us in this city. It is certainly true, no eye has seen, no ear has heard what God has in store for those who love him. And this city will be the greatest expression of his love to his bride. Can't wait. Okay, so to summarize really quick, I want to just bullet point some of the elements of the New Jerusalem that I think are important here to highlight to end our time. First of all, it's a massive city. And we talked about how massive it is. It's a guarded city. It has a large, thick wall with gates, but it's accessible. There are 3 gates on every side of the city. And we'll talk more about the accessibility of the city in chapter 22. It's a beautiful city. Precious gemstones, gold and pearl, with properties that don't even exist today. Also akin to that, it's a wealthy city. These are the most valuable commodities, the most valuable minerals and stones in the ancient world being described here. And going all the way back to the beginning of our reading today, it's a holy city. It's a city that's set apart unto the Lord and unto his people. And we'll talk more about the holiness of the New Jerusalem again when we get to chapter 22. All right, I think we're going to end there for now. That's enough for one day. Hope you enjoyed this session. We'll dismiss class, and Joel will be with you next time for another fun session talking about the New Jerusalem. We're just going to have fun here at the end, guys. It's been a lot of heavy stuff in this book, so last 2 chapters, we're just going to have some fun. And Lord knows right now we need it. So, as always, blessings to you. We love you. And Maranatha.